Autumn, 2023. Lawrence, Kansas. The town lay low under a mottled sky, its streets carved by railroad tracks and combed by long prairie winds, smelling of damp dust, diesel, and the faint sweetness of old grain. On the far side of the university campus, the archives building kept its own weather, dim and still, the air tinged with varnish and paper rot. Here, desk lamps pressed pale circles of light into the dark, their cones revealing more than they should have. It was under one such lamp that a scanned glass negative from 1907 flickered onto a monitor. At first glance, it was just another piece of local history, a farmhouse porch, bleached by sun and time, with a small girl at its center. Clara Merrick, age 7, stood holding a porcelain doll in a lace dress. But the archivist who zoomed in stopped breathing. In the doll's glass eyes, there was depth, impossible depth. Not the flat glare of early photography, but a blackness that seemed to swallow the light entirely. It wasn't curiosity the image provoked. It was awe, edged with a dread that rose slowly in the chest. That image carried a date, June 18, 1907, but the story it hinted at had no tidy boundary. 116 years later, the room fell silent as the staff gathered around the monitor. They weren't looking at a mere artifact. They were looking at a fracture, in time, in memory, in something harder to name. The hum of air conditioners and the distant clatter of a freight train layered over another kind of sound, the whisper of a long-buried legend. The fire that had swallowed the Merrick family was still remembered in scattered local gossip, but the official record had been kept dry as bone, a few column inches in the Lawrence Gazette, and nothing more. In the university's basement stacks, boxes were marked administrative use only, in fading type. Every one of those locks, and the silences that went with them, seemed to turn to the same unseen hand, a charitable board, a private museum in Chicago, and, always at the far end, the North American Heritage Trust. Its founder, Edgar Winslow, was a name that came up in donation ledgers and closed-door agreements like the shadow of a man who never needed a key. From Massachusetts Street, where tavern signs swayed in the wind, the city seemed to stare back at the black windows of the archives, not with welcome, but with the weary patience of a place that has learned to live with secrets. Julia Carter liked to say that archives were not quiet, they merely spoke in a different register. On October 3, 2023, she wrote in her notebook, "Noise of paper equals proof of life." Ben capped her pen and stared at the genealogy chart that had just landed in her inbox. The chart was a plain tangle of lines and dates, the kind of family web she had drawn 100 times for students who thought ancestry would rescue them from the present. But one line buckled her breath: Merrick, Clara, sister to Ruth Merrick M. Jacob Carter, 1918, Atchison County. It wasn't proof of blood, not yet, just a cold thread across a century that pulled at something she did not name. Julia had built a career on stubborn conviction. Memory should not depend on anyone's whims, not a trustee's, not a donor's, not a rich man's laundered generosity. She taught visual media history at the university, wore the same slate cardigan through most semesters, and lived alone in a brick building 2 blocks from Massachusetts Street, where the bars sang and the trains shook the glass. At 41, with hair pulled back in a working knot and a voice made for rooms with bad acoustics, she preferred records to people because records, even when they lied the same way every time. The town answered her conviction with weather. Rain arrived in thin, stubborn lines, the kind that polished the streets without washing anything away. Lawrence lay low under it, breathing steam from manhole covers, breathing something else from its attics. Over the old grain elevators south of the river, wind tore loose sheets of tin and carried a scent that didn't belong to rain, a faint, acrid sweetness, like ashes wetted long after a fire. The Merrick's farmhouse had burned on November 9, 1907. This was merely autumn burn-off from fields, the rational mind insisted. But the odor threaded its way into nights that should have smelled of wet leaves and cold limestone. In the archives, a technician named Liano ran the high-resolution scanner with ritual care. He favored jazz in his earbuds and kept a jar of peppermints by the mouse. On October 6, the scanner stuttered, then restarted itself, skipping exactly 17 minutes in the log file, a neat, black interval between 21:13 and 21:30. Security recorded nothing, no door, no motion, no one. Later, Julia would print that log and circle the gap in red grease pencil. For now, she told herself that aging servers had their moods, and that superstition was a parasite that fed best on tired people. The doll sat 3 blocks away, underground. In the museum storage, under a foam cradle and muslin, the label read, Porcelain Doll. Europe, circa 1900. Donor Dr. Lawrence A. Green. Accession 1954.21. The wrist was marred by a tiny dark spot, the way a drop of something once warm dries on glaze and refuses to be cleaned. Julia signed the sheet, lifted the cover, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with climate control. The glass eyes were calm and blind. Only the photograph from June 1907 made them seem deep. She noted the lace pattern, a slightly crooked scallop above the hem. A matching doll, a twin, existed only in rumors and a blurred silhouette on the left edge of a 1910 picnic print. She began to map the provenance like a crime. Dr. Green, a general practitioner in Lawrence from 1898 to 1912, 2 published notes in Kansas Medical Journal on childhood melancholia, 1 move to St. Louis in 1913, 1 wartime volunteer posting to a convalescent hospital, 1 daughter, Marilyn. The Green donation arrived boxed within a larger shipment labeled European Artifacts Gifted by Private Supporters, all processed under a letterhead that, in today's language, smelled like a shell entity, the North American Heritage Trust. Winslow's name touched that paper lightly, like a signature faint under erasure. Edgar Winslow, philanthropist, collector, the kind of man newspapers describe in layers of velvet, benefactor, patron, visionary, until the person vanishes and only benefactions remain. His trust's money had built the museum's climate vault in 2002 and paid for the scanning rig in 2019. It had also placed a friendly hand on every decision that mattered without ever appearing at the table. Julia found him in donor lists, in gala photographs, in the long silences of board minutes. W&SLW appeared in the margins of one memo as if a clerk had been warned to keep the vowels to himself. Other signals arrived, the kind polite towns ignore. A donor report Julia requested returned redacted, thick with gray rectangles that hid names no one could legally hide. An inventory of objects with reduced provenance transparency. The phrase itself, a machine built to misdirect, was locked behind a password she didn't have. A week later, a message came to her private email from a domain registered that morning and gone by night. You want that list? Not on campus. Off the record. Another said only 17. No signature, no greeting, only the number that had eaten the scanner's log. She walked the edges. In the server room, the lights hummed like patient insects. The air was dry and smelled of plastic, dust, and the copper tang of warm circuitry. Liano swore the UPS had not tripped. The building engineers swore no breaker had thrown. Julia scrolled the security camera timeline and watched black, the perfect rectangle of non-information, pass under her cursor. She marked the time on a legal pad and later, lying awake, counted 17 in a whisper to match her breaths, as if by making the number ordinary she could tame it. The city wore its past in brick and soot. On cold nights, the bar windows fogged and the sidewalk glittered with the spill of beer and laughter. The paper mills were long gone, the stockyards a memory. But other industries thrived: storage, donation, display. A private museum in Chicago announced an upcoming exhibition, The Human Image, 1880 to 1910, Faces, Fetishes, Phantoms. The press release traveled by the usual paths, all tasteful serif and carefully curated adjectives. 2 pieces were teased as a rare European pair, provenance confidential, for security. The photographs in the release showed nothing but silhouettes under domes of glass, but Julia felt the hem scallop in her fingers and knew the language of bait when she read it. She pressed on. At the county courthouse, a clerk with chipped nail polish and the patience of saints brought microfilms with the Merrick deeds and the fire report. The report was a single page, nightmare in bureaucratic miniature, cause undetermined. Structure lost total. Casualties 3, The daughter's line was left blank, as if the paper itself had hesitated. In a church registry, the name Clara appeared in a neat hand with a baptism date, then no burial entry. A librarian in Topeka sent a scan of a society column from 1906. Miss Clara Merrick, with her foreign doll, visited the ice cream social. The phrase arrested the eye not for ignorance but for emphasis, foreign, as if the object had a passport when the child did not. At night, Julia dreamed of lists. Accession numbers marched like regimental men across ledger paper. Family names rose and sank. The doll's pupils reflected not lamps, but corridors, a depth that swallowed distance like water. She woke at 3:17, again and again, the digital clock faced a small courtroom where numbers sat in judgment. She told no one that the hour frightened her. She told herself she was tired, that pattern hunger devours the rational mind if you let it. On October 14th, she opened a cardboard banker's box in a back aisle and found a folder stamped "Administrative, not for loan." Inside were 7 photographs and a letter on brittle onion skin. The photographs showed the museum's vault in 1954, a smaller room then, the walls uninsulated, a row of wooden shelving and crates with stenciled arrows. In one, a woman in a calf-length skirt and pearls held up the doll to face the camera. The porcelain hand was pristine, no dark spot broke the glaze. In another, a man's sleeve entered the frame to point at something off-camera. The letter was from Dr. Green, offering "objects of European origin acquired in the course of clinical travel," a phrase so false it trembled. The child, he wrote in a postscript, was not well. Julia shut the folder and let her hands rest flat on the cardboard lid. Objects acquire people, people acquire objects, sometimes the acquiring goes both ways. She had written a line like that in a freshman lecture, and watched half the class brighten with the joy of easy aphorism. Here, in the dry air of the stacks, the line felt less clever and more like a warning. When she stepped outside, the wind carried the smell again, that burnt sweetness, and for a moment she thought she saw it leave her mouth like smoke when she exhaled. On her phone, the university's network pinged with a new message, re-inquiry. It contained a scanned memo from 2002, when the climate vault was built. A single paragraph had been left unredacted. Certain donors may require non-standard access windows. Standard procedure will classify these periods as scheduled maintenance. Duration, up to 0:17. She read it twice, then once more, then forwarded it to her private account and deleted the sent copy. The sky above the river bruised toward evening. The storm's sirens, the old prairie guardians, were tested on the first Wednesday of each month at noon. That day wasn't Wednesday, and it wasn't noon, and yet some other siren seemed to move through the air, a whisper scream of sealed donor reports, vanished inventories, phone calls from numbers that resolved to nowhere. A private number rang and cut off after one pulse. Another text arrived, "You're close. Don't use work phones. Chicago moves in 3 weeks." She stood on the museum steps with the wind in her coat and thought, not of danger or of triumph, but of Clara in the photograph, the doll's weight in small arms, the porch boards dry with summer. If the image was a fracture, then something once fell through it. And if something fell through, perhaps something else could be lifted back. In the lamplit quiet of her office, Julia taped the 17-minute log to the chalkboard and wrote, beneath it, a date, June 18, 1907. Then another, November 9, 1907. Then, October 2023. Lines connected nothing to nothing in a web only the patient could endure. Outside, the town politely looked away, as towns do when the machinery of wealth hums. Inside, the spring coiled tighter. And the doll, one of them, waited under muslin, its hand marked by a single dark drop that would not come clean. The trail was fragile, like tracing smoke, but it led Julia to St. Louis. Dr. Lawrence Green had ended his years here, far from the Kansas prairie and the black scar where the Merrick house once stood. He had died in 1962, survived by one child, a daughter who, at 79, still lived in the 2-story home he had purchased after the war. Marilyn Hughes answered Julia's knock with the composure of someone used to visitors bringing questions they never quite asked outright. Her house smelled faintly of lemon polish and a perfume from another era, the kind that clung to upholstery and wool coats. Furniture stood as if on exhibit, every clock wound, every book dusted, curtains drawn to equal lengths. The space felt less like a home than a private museum aware of its own value. Julia explained her research in the careful, academic register she used with cautious donors. Marilyn listened without interruption, eyes steady, weighing not only the words but their purpose. After a long pause, she said simply, "My father kept records," and led Julia up a narrow carpeted staircase. In the back bedroom, she unlocked a cedar trunk whose brass fittings had dulled to a greenish patina. Beneath neatly folded shawls and pressed newspaper clippings lay her father's papers, photographs, correspondence, and a sheaf of medical notes bound with a sun-faded ribbon. The pages smelled faintly of chloroform and something harder to name, a trace of fear pressed into the fibers. In a looping, disciplined hand, Dr. Green had written of acute melancholia with delusional features in a child under his care. But the clinical voice did not hold. By the third page, margins filled with jagged additions, "It watches from where I put it. Steps in the hall with doors locked. Shadow moves when the candle does not." Somewhere between case file and confession, the tone shifted again, sentences collapsing into fragments, almost telegrams. "Cannot destroy. Will not release. Must remain paired." The final entry broke off mid-line, "Not mine to end." Julia turned the pages slowly. Objects in the room seemed to echo the unease of the writing. In the mirrored door of a wardrobe, the light caught a blemish that formed, at certain angles, a head in profile. On the back of a faded photograph of the Merrick porch, she found the blurred imprint of a child's hand, too faint for dust, too sharp for chance. "He said some things hold memory differently," Marilyn remarked from the doorway. "It's not sentiment. It's weight. And some weights can pull you under if you keep them too close." From the bottom of the trunk, she drew out a small, blackened notebook. Its edges were curled with heat, many pages gone entirely. On the surviving leaves, childish handwriting wavered between careful loops and sudden, violent scrawls. Julia's breath tightened when she saw her own name written there, Julia, in letters uneven but unmistakable. It appeared twice, once alone, and once beside a sentence half erased by fire, "Julia will carry it across." She looked up. "Where did this come from?" "It came with the chest," Marilyn said, her voice flat. She offered no further explanation, as though the question itself were irrelevant. They spoke little after that. Julia photographed the most fragile items under Marilyn's watchful eye, aware she was being allowed only a measured glimpse. When she left, the notebook was in her satchel, its charred pages shifting faintly as if in response to movement. Outside, St. Louis moved in its usual rhythms, traffic shivering on wet asphalt, vendors shouting along narrow streets, the slow tilt of winter light along brick facades. But the notebook altered the weight of Julia's steps, its presence impossible to ignore. That night in her hotel room, she spread the photographs across the desk. The doll appeared in three, once on the Merrick porch, once in a doctor's examination room, and once, most unnervingly, beside an unlit fireplace, the glass eyes catching a light source that wasn't in frame. The witness here was not a person in the ordinary sense. It was a lattice of signs, handwriting warped by heat, shadows preserved in emulsion, objects positioned with deliberate care. Each clue pointed toward a pattern that resisted direct approach, as if seeing too much at once might cause it to vanish. Julia understood the risk. She had studied enough vanished archives to know that patterns are like animals, some can be tracked head-on, others only in circles. So she circled, letting the fragments breathe, waiting for them to align in their own time. Still, as she prepared her notes, she caught herself writing a sentence she could not explain. The witness does not speak, but it remembers. She stared at the words for a long time before underlining them twice. In the early hours, she woke from a dream in which she stood once more on the Merrick porch. Clara's dress stirred in a wind Julia could not feel, and in the doll's porcelain eyes was not depth but movement, slow, tidal, and aware. The charred notebook lay open in Clara's lap, and on its exposed page was her own handwriting, though she had never written those lines in her life. She could not remember the words upon waking, only the sensation of being read in return. By late October, Julia's notes formed a constellation too ordered to ignore. The Merrick fire, the doll in the museum's storage, Dr. Green's sealed donation, and the shadowy touch of Edgar Winslow's trust, each thread crossed the others with deliberate geometry. It was not the chaos of rumor. It was a system. She began with the obvious. Dr. Green's donation to the university had not been a solitary act of generosity. It was part of a larger shipment labeled European Artifacts Gifted by Private Supporters, processed under a legal entity whose name alone sounded like an alibi, the North American Heritage Trust. The trust's incorporation records revealed Winslow's hand in its founding and its peculiar tax-exempt status, designed to pass items between institutions without triggering public disclosures. Julia mapped shipments from the 1950s to the present. The routes formed a loop. Objects would arrive at public museums, undergo brief cataloging, then, often after a closed evaluation, disappear into loans to affiliate collections. These affiliates were almost always private museums or galleries with minimal oversight, sometimes housed in the upper floors of unmarked buildings. There, under the umbrella of scholarly access, Winslow's circle could view them away from any public gaze. 2 staff from the university archive had resigned abruptly before a scheduled audit in 2014. A third was reassigned, without explanation after asking to review donor conditions. Internal emails, once obtained through a sympathetic IT contact, revealed a standing protocol for items with reduced provenance transparency. The language was bureaucratic but the meaning clear. Such items were to be transferred quietly to institutions where the questions would be fewer, and the answers, if any, controlled. Julia read the memos in the dim light of her office, the blinds drawn. In one, a curator in Chicago wrote, "Shipment received. Handling window completed. No incident." Another referenced 17-minute protocols, the same phrase from the 2002 Climate Vault memo. Her stomach tightened. The doll's own history had been processed under these protocols. In 1954, it was photographed, labeled, and shelved in the museum vault. In 1963, a request for special viewing was approved for a Winslow affiliate in Chicago. The return manifest was blank where the signature should have been. Yet somehow, decades later, the doll sat again in Lawrence, its reappearance undocumented, as if it had materialized back into inventory. She called a contact in Chicago, a retired registrar named Phelps, who agreed to meet in a diner on the edge of the city. Over black coffee, he told her about shipments that vanished mid-route. No theft report, no insurance claim. Just gone. And then, maybe years later, something similar would turn up with different paperwork, as if it had been somewhere that didn't exist on maps. Why the secrecy? Julia asked. Phelps stirred sugar into his coffee. Because some things aren't just worth money. They're worth control. Winslow's people don't want to own objects, they want to own the stories those objects carry. You take the thing out of public reach, you take the memory with it. Then you decide who gets to see it, who gets to know. The Chicago affiliate's website announced an upcoming exhibition, The Human Image, 1880 to 1910, Faces, Fetishes, Phantoms. It promised a rare European pair, the phrasing calculated to prick curiosity without revealing specifics. Julia saw the bait for what it was. If one doll sat in Lawrence, the second, the attic-bound twin in Marilyn Hughes's possession, was the other half of Winslow's pair. The urgency sharpened. Winslow's trust operated like a pump, drawing items from public custody into private orbit. Once paired under glass in his hall, the dolls would be insulated by layers of private security and legal ownership. Removing them afterward would be nearly impossible without triggering the machinery of law, machinery Winslow had long since learned to oil. Julia returned to Lawrence with photocopied manifests, photographs of crates, and a sense of closing distance. The university board was no ally. Too many of its members owed their careers or their departments to Winslow's funding. The museum staff had grown cautious, even evasive. And yet, beneath the surface, resistance hummed. An anonymous email arrived with a single attachment, a scanned page of internal security logs. The doll's crate had been moved to a restricted evaluation area for exactly 17 minutes before its scheduled transfer to Chicago. 17 minutes? Enough for a handoff, a substitution, or something less tangible. When she showed the log to Marilyn, the older woman studied it without surprise. "They think they're moving pieces on a board," she said, "but they don't see the other game being played." She did not explain what she meant. The pieces were in motion, whether Julia was ready or not. Winslow's exhibition was 3 weeks away. Between now and then, the twins would have to be brought together, but not in the way the trust intended. The problem was simple in description and nearly impossible in practice: intercept the Chicago-bound transfer without leaving a trail that Winslow's lawyers could use to crush everyone involved. In her office, Julia pinned photographs and manifests to the corkboard. Lines of red thread ran between Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, looping through dates and names. At the center was a photograph of the doll, its porcelain hand marked by the stubborn dark spot. Beside it, she pinned a grainy image from the 1910 picnic, the faint silhouette of another doll, its lace hem caught mid-swing. Objects could be silenced. Stories could be buried. But patterns had a way of surfacing, even through the deepest layers of dust. And in the quiet hum of the office, Julia realized the pattern was no longer just about history. It was moving now, in the present, and it was moving toward her. The plan was born out of necessity, in a conversation that barely qualified as one. Julia sat in Marilyn Hughes's parlor, the curtains drawn against the cold gray light, a tea service untouched between them. On the low table lay the attic secret, a carved wooden chest with iron hinges, its lid worn smooth by decades of handling. Marilyn lifted it without ceremony. Inside, wrapped in yellowing linen, lay the second doll. Its porcelain was the color of skimmed milk. The lace dress, though delicate, showed the resilience of hand-stitching done for permanence, not ornament. The dark spot bloomed in the same place as on the Lawrence doll's hand, but the lace hem differed by a barely perceptible asymmetry, one scallop shorter, as though the seamstress had been interrupted. "They were sisters," Marilyn said, not looking at Julia. "Separated before they learned what that meant." Julia knew Winslow's exhibition in Chicago promised a rare European pair. It was more than coincidence. It was a declaration. The Lawrence doll was already scheduled for transfer under the Trust's sealed protocols. Once under Winslow's dome, the twins would be locked into his private orbit forever. 3 weeks. That was the time between now and the exhibition's opening. The roads between St. Louis and Lawrence stretched across November landscapes. Low fields shorn for winter, wind stripping the last leaves from the cottonwoods, the horizon sharpened by cold. Along those routes, security could be hidden in plain sight. In Lawrence, figures in gray suits began appearing in the museum's lower corridors. Their badges bore the name of a cultural property consultancy, but no one could read the fine print before the men were gone again. Julia received polite but firm inquiries about her departmental priorities, from a dean she had spoken to only twice in 10 years. Her inbox filled with messages heavy with implication: "Your professional reputation deserves protection. Consider the funding impacts of unnecessary inquiries." Then came the unsigned alerts, arriving at odd hours, single-word subject lines: "Found, heard soon." The body of each email was blank. Her phone rang once in the small hours, then went silent before she could answer. Every decision now balanced between caution and speed. To wait too long was to watch the twins vanish into Winslow's collection. To move too soon was to invite the Trust's machinery to grind her down before she reached Chicago. She began assembling a small network, not allies in the heroic sense, but people with something to lose if Winslow's grip tightened further. A freight dispatcher in St. Louis who owed her a favor from a lecture she'd given at his niece's college. A conservator in Kansas City who had seen too many artifacts vanish under the phrase restricted access. Marilyn herself, who, for all her reticence, moved with the deliberate certainty of someone who had been waiting years for a specific moment. The plan was simple in description, bring the twins together on neutral ground before Winslow could. But nothing in the trust's reach was truly neutral. The fewer people who knew the full route, the better. Each leg of the journey would be compartmentalized, Marilyn carrying the attic twin partway, Julia shadowing the transfer of the Lawrence doll, the handoff occurring somewhere outside the predictable lanes of museum logistics. The closer the date came, the more the air in Lawrence seemed to change. The storm sirens tested on the first Wednesday of the month sounded different now, not louder, but heavier, as though carrying a weight of warning meant only for her. In the reflection of the museum's glass doors, she sometimes caught the shape of someone who wasn't there when she turned. And in her desk drawer, beneath a folder of accession reports, lay the charred notebook. On some nights she thought the scent of burnt paper grew stronger, as if reminding her of the promise written in another hand, Julia will carry it across. It ended not in the white silence of a museum hall, but in the oil and iron shadow of an old freight depot on the south edge of St. Louis. The plan's final coordinates had come from the freight dispatcher, a narrow window when the platform schedule was mysteriously cleared, no trains in or out for an hour. To anyone outside the network, it looked like routine maintenance. Rain came down in hard, vertical lines, drumming on the corrugated roof and pooling in the grooves between warped planks. The air smelled of wet timber, rust, and something faintly electric from the old sodium lamps. A single light burned above the center platform, casting a cone of yellow over a carved wooden crate. Inside that crate, wrapped in muslin, was the Lawrence doll. Opposite it, in Marilyn's arms, was the attic twin. They faced each other across the slick boards, unmoving, porcelain eyes catching fragments of light. The depot's doors clanged shut. From the shadows, gray-suited men emerged, their shoes silent on the wet wood. The consultancy's badges were gone. These were Winslow's people in their true form. One moved to bar the office door, another checked a handheld device that pulsed a faint green, a signal jammer. Julia's phone screen went dead. The pressure was physical, like a hand between her shoulder blades. Winslow himself was not here, he never was, but his will filled the space like weather. Every movement of his men was measured, designed to collapse the distance between Julia and the crate. But every system has a limit. Winslow's power thrived in silence and controlled rooms. Here, under a single failing lamp, visibility was its own P***n. Julia and Marilyn knelt together, undoing the latches on both crates. The sound was louder than expected, metallic and final. The lids opened. Light touched porcelain. The two figures stood inches apart, not identical but bound by the unmistakable echo of their making. No ritual, no words, only the fact of their reunion after more than a century's separation. The nearest gray suit froze, eyes flicking between them as though calculating risk. Then the depot's lights went out. In the heartbeat of darkness, rain hammered the roof like static, and somewhere a fuse blew with a muffled pop. Emergency beacons flared to life, flooding the space in red. What happened next moved like a chain reaction. A security camera sparked and died, its lens blooming white. The jammer's green light flickered then failed. One of the men dropped a black case. It struck the floor with a hollow crack, its contents spilling, wires, clamps, a small lens wrapped in velvet. In the redlit stillness, Julia felt the air shift. The twin dolls' porcelain hands lay side by side, their fingers almost touching. Between them ran a narrow seam of shadow, and in that seam the oppressive weight in the room seemed to retreat by an inch. She never saw Winslow's face, but she imagined him elsewhere, feeling the loss as a sudden emptiness in the architecture of his collection. The control he had built over decades had not been shattered by force, but by the quiet refusal to let the objects be divided any longer. The men began to move again, but their precision was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Julia stepped back, letting the red light hold the scene. Some victories did not need to be carried away, they only needed to be witnessed. By morning, the depot was just another rain-darkened building on the edge of the St. Louis yards. Trucks came and went, carrying ordinary freight. Yet the night had left a quiet mark, not in arrests or headlines, but in the subtle disruptions of routine. The St. Louis Ledger ran a cautious piece, security glitch disrupts private transfer, investigation pending. No names appeared, only a photograph of the padlocked depot doors and a vague reference to electronic failure. But the image was enough to invite speculation in the narrow circles that followed such matters. In Lawrence, the university board convened in closed session. 2 trustees resigned within days, citing personal reasons. The museum announced it would review all restricted collections for provenance and public access, a promise that, though modest in wording, broke a decades-long pattern. The insurance company, less gentle, demanded 10 years of affidavits from the Heritage Trust, its tone more suspicious than cooperative. Winslow's name surfaced just once, in a press release about mission restructuring and aligning with best practices. In the county archive, the Merrick family's records reappeared in their proper place. At the site where their farmhouse had stood, a bronze plaque was set into a low limestone block. The inscription was simple: Clara Merrick, 1900? Ruth Merrick, Jacob Carter. Lost to the fire, November 9, 1907. The prairie wind, restless for decades, seemed to ease as it passed there, as if acknowledging that the names had been spoken again. Marilyn Hughes locked her attic for good. A week later, Julia received a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a folded letter and a pale ribbon once used to tie Dr. Green's papers. The letter was brief: "Some things are not meant to be kept, only returned. Thank you for carrying it across." Neither doll appeared again in any official inventory. They were not listed as stolen, misplaced, or destroyed. They were simply absent, as though they had stepped off the page into a space beyond catalog numbers and valuations. Winslow's influence did not collapse in scandal, but eroded from within. Without the twins, his rare pair became a gap in his collection that no acquisition could disguise. Julia's final report for the archives described the system's operations and failures in meticulous terms, omitting her own role. She left deliberate silences, spaces for the unrecorded, those 17 minutes when the camera saw nothing and history seemed to breathe. In her desk drawer, she kept one photograph, a circle of light on the depot floor, 2 porcelain figures, their thin fingers almost touching. On the back, in faded ink from another century, were 2 words: Sisters Forever. The city returned to its familiar rhythms: trains at dusk, bar windows fogged against the cold, storm sirens tested on the first Wednesday of each month. Yet Julia knew that behind certain locked storerooms, and in the attics of houses that never made the historic register, there were still crates with carved markings, each with its own silent clock. Any one of them might have its own 17 minutes someday, when the light falters and something long divided finds its way back together. And if that day came, someone else would be there to carry it across.